Hello and welcome. Thank you for watching this video series. I hope you've enjoyed it thus far. We now venture into the more personal segment of this video series. This production has gone on for several months. We've had a lot of feedback, and we're going to venture now into answering the detractors, additions, and corrections. Yes, this is the part the atheists like the most, the part where Ian Juby says, I was wrong. Yeah, I know. What can I say? I'm only human too. I make mistakes as well. And a day before we started shooting this video series, my dad got airlifted to intensive care in Ottawa, where he fought for his life for 76 days, and I was 3,000 kilometers away from home in front of a bunch of television cameras. So it was, to say the least, not my best performance. I was stressed, underprepared, dreadfully tired, and well, I just made a lot more mistakes than I would even normally make. And of course, I am only human. So we're going to start off this segment with corrections. And we're going to try and set straight some of the mistakes that I made throughout the series, starting with God's little creation. In God's little creation, the children's segment of the video series, I said this about the T-Rex tooth.
Its tooth, but its tooth only goes into the gums this far. What's going to happen if it bites another dinosaur?
Now, a good friend of mine from Montana set me straight on this. That's not entirely true. I was correct in the length of the T-Rex tooth. However, it is much deeper buried into the gums than I thought. Now, I would still contend that T-Rex would break its teeth if it actually bit the hide of another dinosaur. But in fact, while this much sticks out, there is about this much that actually embedded into the roots of the T-Rex gums. And so, on that note, I'd like to set that record straight. However, I would also like to emphasize that even though I may have been wrong on that, it still very much appears that T-Rex was a vegetarian. Interestingly, I am not the only one to say so. Jack Horner, an evolutionary paleontologist, world-famous paleontologist, and T-Rex excavator, even he too agrees T-Rex probably was a vegetarian. And he argued that basically primarily from the small arms that T-Rex had. They're not suitable for catching prey or holding prey while it eats it, etc. It is, however, good for canes and stalks and grasses. So I'm not the only one that's suggesting that T-Rex was a vegetarian. Again, I'm not being dogmatic about this. I wasn't there. I don't know. So, anyway, moving right along. In part one, there was an erroneous quote that I made from Sir Charles Lyell. Now, what I'd said was that Charles wrote in a letter to one of his friends, I conceived of the idea 5 or 6 years ago that if ever the Mosaic chronology could be set down without giving offense, it would be an unhistorical sketch. Now, that's not quite accurate. What he said was, I conceived the idea 5 or 6 years ago that if ever the Mosaic geology could be set down without giving offense, it would be an unhistoric sketch. My point remains the same. He discredited Moses and Moses' geology and history by making up his own history and his own geology. My point remains the same, but nevertheless, I do wish to correct that erroneous quote, which has been running around the internet actually for quite some time apparently. Okay, in part 7, I was talking about carbon-14 and the formation of carbon-14. I erroneously said that nitrogen-14 loses an electron to become carbon-14. That's not true. It loses a proton. It also gains a neutron. I didn't go into that, and there's technical reasons for this. It has to do with the ultraviolet interaction with gases, etc., in the upper atmosphere. So a couple of creationists caught that. Surprisingly, no skeptics set me straight on that. I was surprised. But anyway, a couple creationists sent me straight on that. Thank you for setting me straight. Okay, also on carbon-14, one of my favorite internet skeptics, L.A. Wilson, said in one of his posts, by the way, C14, or carbon-14 dating, is radiometric dating. Now, he's correct. I'm not denying that, and certainly wasn't implying that it was not radiometric dating method. What I was trying to do was differentiate between carbon-14 dating, which is used for once-living organisms, and the other radiometric dating methods, which are used on rocks. So one's for once-living organisms, the other is for materials that never were living, like rocks. So I wasn't trying to imply anything else. Anyway, he's correct. I'm not saying that he was wrong. Just understand where I was coming from. I was simply trying to keep it at a layman's level, is what I was trying to do. Okay, in part 9, I showed you this picture. This was of the Ziggurat of Ur. It said this was the original Tower of Babel. That is not correct. Archaeologists, the Ziggurat of Ur was probably the first replica of the Tower of Babel. In fact, most archaeologists agree it was the Ziggurat of Edamananke that was the original Tower of Babel. So, my bad, set that straight. Also in part 9, I showed you this photograph of Dale Fuller, who is the bulldozer operator who originally uncovered the Moab man's skeletons near Moab, Utah. Now, Mr. Fuller here, what I said in the video, there was no faults in that area. Actually, Mr. Fuller is pointing to the fault in that area, and that is the fault that runs through the area where the skeletons were found. Now, a fault is not a crevasse, so it doesn't help the skeptical argument that this was some poor Indian who was walking along and fell into this crevasse and somehow got magically and mysteriously buried in these sediments in sedimentary layers that were deeper than they were supposed to. That's still a nonsensical argument. It's a fault, not a crevasse. Nevertheless, because I was not the one who talked to Mr. Fuller, Vance Nelson was, I misunderstood what Vance said. So, sets that straight as well. In part 12, I was talking about the flagella tail of the bacterium, and I said that it was made up of 30,000 proteins. That is not correct. Now, the correction actually enhances my case. It was 30,000 protein units. Each protein unit is composed of 4 different proteins, so if you want to get technical, the tail is actually made of 120,000 proteins or more, depending on how many protein assemblies get added on and how many proteins are in the protein assembly, etc. I also said in part 12, when I was talking about that, said that when you lose the cap, you lose 90% of the system. Ugh. I was tired. What can I say? I don't know where that number came from. I pulled it out of a hat because it's wrong. I wouldn't even agree with that number. The point I was making still stands, but you don't lose 90% of the system by losing one part. You do, however, lose the propulsion system, or the motility, the method of movement. You do lose that by the loss of even just that cap, because then the bacteria no longer grows the tail, it falls apart, and they can't grow a tail, and so it's like removing the drive shaft from a car. Now, a number of skeptics have advanced the idea that what they call the TTSS system was the precursor to the bacteria flagellum. Now, I'm going to come back to that in the additions segment. In fact, I'll write that down right now so I don't forget. TTSS system. We will come back to that because that is worthy of a revisitation. I hear that argument enough, and I didn't cover that in the video series. So I should cover that in more detail. In part 12, one of the skeptics took issue with what I said about a frog turning into a prince. So we didn't evolve from a frog, basically we didn't evolve from a frog. I agree, we didn't evolve from a frog. However, his point is that evolutionists would not claim that we evolved from a frog. I agree. Evolutionists would claim that an unknown amphibian evolved into a university professor. Unknown amphibian, university professor. Frog, prince. I don't see a difference. Really. So just because I oversimplified it for the layman doesn't nullify my argument. It is still just as ridiculous a story to suggest that an unknown amphibian somehow miraculously turned into a university professor, and it's just as ridiculous to say that as it is to say that a frog turned into a prince. On that note, also in video number 12, I believe it was Sweaty Tooth Madman. I'm not sure about that, but one of the users on YouTube, in watching my video, apparently misunderstood what I said. Now, I'm glad you mentioned this because the way I worded it, it almost implied like I was saying the first life evolutionists believed that evolved was a bacteria with a flagellum. Now, that's not true. I know that's not what evolutionists would claim. Evolutionists would claim it was a more simple life form. So thank you for bringing that up. I do want to clarify that. On that note, I will simply say this. There is no such thing as a simple cell, as evolutionists would claim. The simple cell is just another fictional character in the evolution myth. There's nothing simple about a cell. Cells, when you take a look inside them, are like something straight out of Star Trek. I mean, they've got force fields, shuttlecraft that go through automatic garage door openers. They take parts from one cell and bring it to the other. Each little part manufactured in the factories has its own zip code that's attached to it, so the shuttlecraft knows where to take it. You've got these incredible factories that produce these machines. You've got robots that crawl up and down these microtubules called kinesin and dynesin, and they transport huge bundles of parts for various places in the cells. It's just astounding to look inside the cell. There's nothing simple about the cell. And if any one of those parts is missing, the whole cell's got a very serious problem. It can die real quick from the loss of one part. There's nothing simple about the cell. Now, in part 15, in talking about the past megavolcanoes, specifically I showed you this map from Yellowstone National Park, which is now believed to be one giant caldera from multiple megavolcanoes. And in this map, unfortunately, I was tired. I repeatedly said, magma instead of ejecta, over and over and over again. Ejecta is what came out of those megavolcanoes, not so much magma. Magma did come out undoubtedly in some cases, but it was more ejecta. So I was tired, I kept using the wrong word. Now, one kind gentleman from Poland wrote in afterwards and set me straight on the argument with Lucy's knee. Now, I had a deliberation about this, which I discussed briefly in the video. I'm going to revisit this because in the addition section, because we need to settle this, because what I said was incorrect. I said the knee that was found 2.5 kilometers from Lucy's skeleton was the one that was on display. That's not true. That was a misunderstanding of what Johansen wrote, even in his letter, which was sent to me in an attempt to correct the situation. So, unfortunately, I'm going to lay the blame for all this confusion still at the feet of the evolutionists, and namely at the feet of Donald Johansen. But we will come back to that. For the moment, I will simply say that the knee that is displayed with Lucy's skeleton is the knee that was found with the Lucy skeleton, and not the one that was found 2.5 kilometers away. I was incorrect in saying that. But we'll come back to that, and we'll revisit that later. Now, what we're going to do next, throughout all this series, as a result of a lot of the feedback, and in particular, a lot of the claims and responses from the skeptics, we're now going to venture into the Answering the Detractors segment. And I'm also going to add on to that with a bunch of other things that I missed during the video series that were brought up in the various comments, primarily on YouTube. That's where most of the feedback came from. But I did get some private emails, as well as people talking to me personally and adding some critique or adding some information or requesting specific answers to specific questions. So, in no particular order, here we go. We're going to start with Answering the Detractors. Those depressions you found in the Tapeach sandstone weren't footprints. Okay, this comes back to what I said in one of the early complete creation videos. I showed a cast this cast, in fact, the fossil footprint right here. And I talked about this. This is cast from a footprint in the Tapete sandstone, dated by the evolutionary community as over 500 million years old. There should be no land-walking animals down that deep. And this was most likely from an amphibian. And so, as a result, I wound up getting railed on the internet. Here is my response in full definition for your enjoyment. Okay, so after posting that video, the skeptic wrote in, he said, well, I took another look at your photographs. I don't think they're footprints. Well, first of all, here's how we know a footprint is a footprint. First of all, the pattern. That's what you look for, is the sequence of right, left, or if you've got an animal with multiple feet, like a quadruped, then you look for the right, left pattern of 4 feet. In this case, it was difficult to discern, because apparently this animal, which presumably had a tail, was being buoyed up in water again. Now let's take a close look at this fossil footprint. Well, first of all, you can see multiple toe impressions. Okay, so this is a fairly large track, and this is very crucial to the argument. Notice that when the foot went in, it displaced mud to the back of the track. So as the foot stepped in and pressed to the back, it displaces mud, just like you do on a beach. So this is very important for the argument. These are genuine fossil footprints. Now, this is just as important. In fact, I would say more important. I am not the one who discovered these footprints. It was Mr. John Mackay from Australia who discovered these fossil footprints. In fact, he found them decades ago. In fact, he's been going down there with people who have gone down there to see these footprints for decades. It wasn't John Mackay or myself who made the mold. It was a completely other person, Mr. W.R. Barnhart. He's the one who made the casts. So people have been going down and examining these tracks for decades. they are genuine, I'm not the only one saying so. As for where's my authority in saying this, I've studied fossil footprints in multiple areas all over North America, Joggins, the Paluxy River, Utah, all over Colorado and Utah, multiple areas. I've done extensive studies in dinosaur tracks, amphibian tracks, insect tracks. I've got copies of insect tracks and amphibian tracks in my collection here in the museum, in my traveling museum. I've been studying fossil footprints all over the place. It's not hard to distinguish them, although it does take a trained eye. I've spent years training my eye to spot fossil footprints, probably over a decade now. In Euclid, the Indonesian tsunami made 3 to 5 layers from one wave. You got a reference for that? Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do have a reference for that. Now, this all started at the 2005 GSA, the Geologic Society of America meeting. It was Dr. Andrew Moore and his team. The article was Sedimentation from the 26th December South Asia Tsunami in Northern Sumatra, Indonesia. Now, as is typical with the GSA, you got to understand, you'll often see get more meat out of the actual meeting where the presenter gives a verbal talk on the subject, whereas the abstract is specifically weak on details. And so the abstract that is available online doesn't give a lot of details. Also, his follow-up article, which did come out in the Journal of Earth, Planets, and Science the following year, on the same subject, he mentions it in both the abstract and in the article. He just refers to it as complex stratigraphy. But at the GSA, what he specifically said was that there was too many layers for the waves. And so he tried to explain it by a back wave and all this other stuff, but none of that lined up. So the simple conclusion was one wave can produce multiple layers. Secondly, if you watch the video series, I showed you this photograph. These were triplets or multiple layers made by one wave. Every single one of those sequence of 3 layers was made by one wave. And any junior high school student can replicate this at home. It's not hard to do. So we verified, even by experimentation in the lab, that one wave can produce 3 to 5 layers. In fact, in our rotary flume, we produced up to 8 layers. Now, that's a little more complex because you had rotational vortices, because of the round nature of the flume, etc. So I don't go by that one, but this was a linear flume. This was very simple. Water comes in one end, goes out the other, and every time water came in and went out the other end, it laid down 3 layers of sediment. Very simple, very clear to see. One wave can lay down multiple layers. We know that. We have verified that in the lab as well. You said Schweitzer found red blood cells. We now know that they were not red blood cells. Okay, this is actually the result of a paper that just came out in the past couple of months. In fact, it came out since the time of the recording of the original Complete Creation series. So I'm glad this came up in the deliberations and debate on YouTube because I'd like to go into it in more detail. First of all, let's backtrack a little. Let's take a look at what Mary Schweitzer and her team originally showed in Science magazine way back in 2005. These are the supposed blood vessels, complete with supposedly red blood cells in them. Not sure what it looks like. They're branching. You could take tweezers and squeeze the red blood cells out of them just like toothpaste. I mean, it was astounding. Later on this year, just this past year, Thomas Kai and his team in the Plus One journal claimed that, in fact, what this was is it was biofilm and framboids, that it wasn't blood vessels at all. Now, by biofilm, what he means is take a bucket of water, for instance, and leave it outside in the elements. And eventually it will grow a thin film of pond scum, really, on the pail. He was saying it was along those lines. It was a biofilm. The framboids, which are small clumps of iron globules, were mistaken to be the red blood cells within them. Now, Schweitzer and her team are sticking to their original arguments, and I'm glad they are because I think they are quite correct. First of all, Kai and his team apparently didn't consider that it could be both genuine T-Rex blood vessels and red blood cells, as well as biofilm and framboids. I mean, for the very same reasons that he argues it's biofilm, it's the very same reason that it could be biofilm along with the blood vessels. In other words, the vessels were there, biofilm built up at the same place. Hey, why not? So apparently he didn't consider this. But first of all, I'm sorry, they're blood cells. You're not going to be able to take biofilm and squeeze framboids out of it like toothpaste. It's just ridiculous, really. So I'm going to disagree with them on that one. I think Schweitzer and their team are quite correct. Secondly, as Schweitzer pointed out, first of all, they tested those red blood cells. They found hemoglobin, or what appeared to be hemoglobin. You're not going to find hemoglobin in framboids. So apparently they found hemoglobin in them. Also, gravity would make biofilm thicker on the bottom of the cavity left behind by the blood vessels. So, but that wasn't there, indicating that it was actually the cell wall of a blood vessel. Now, also, it wasn't just blood cells and blood vessels. Check out this picture here. I showed you these photographs in the video series. Remember, this was basically T-Rex meat. They took portions of this, stretched it, and when they let it go, it stretched back into its original shape. Astounding. I don't think they're red blood cells. I don't think it's biofilm or framboids. I think Schweitzer and their team are quite correct in their original interpretation. She's sticking by her guns, and I'm glad they are, because Kai and his team really do not answer the majority of the arguments brought up by Schweitzer and their team, who, by the way, did consider the biofilm explanation in their original research, and they rejected it for the very same reasons they're bringing up now. Now, also amongst the Columbia River flood basalts, check this photo out. This is palagonite, intermixed with pillow basalts, which are laid down in a cross-bedded fashion, sandwiched in between the Columbia River flood basalts. As we all know from the video series, as I showed you by our experiments done in the lab, crossbeds are formed by water. I don't think anyone will deny that these crossbeds were made by water, a large amount of water. Last but not least, the Columbia River flood basalts are tholeiitic. In the words of Wikipedia, tholeiitic basalts are the most common volcanic rocks on Earth, as they are produced by submarine volcanism